Don't tell them. They'll all leave. So thank you all for coming instead of going to the best paper session. Hopefully the session will be good enough that you'll feel like, wow, I didn't make a bad choice. So this talk, the first author is Mike Pedro, who is a doctoral student at Worcester Polytechnic, and he is defending his doctorate next week. So he decided he wanted to stay home and prepare rather than coming here, which I think it would have been great preparation to have come here. But at any rate, so data mining and learning analytics are powerful methods for building predictive models, which we sometimes call detectors, of ill-defined behavior and skills. Stuff that's not easy to kind of rationally say, this is what the construct is, but you have to get at it in other ways. And the power of EDM and learning analytics is to measure how well models can generalize by testing with data not used to build them. It's not the only great thing, but it's one of the great things, especially compared to more rational approaches. And this allows for assessing the reliability and scalability of models. But one question is, if we think that it's important to evaluate model generalizability using methods like cross-validation, what level should we cross-validate at? Because there's a lot of ways you can cross-validate. You could just cross-validate flatly. You could just say any data point can be in either the training or test set. And that can work for some things, but if you've got data from, multiple data from the same student, you might be in a situation of predicting a student from their own data, which means you've validated your model work on new data from the very same students, which usually isn't your goal. Another thing you can do is student-level cross-validation, which asks, is the model successful at making the prediction for an entirely new student in the sample? And that validates to some degree that the model will work for new students. And it's probably the most common kind of cross-validation, at least over in EDM world. A second type is population-level cross-validation, which says, is the model any good at making a prediction for a new population? And it's really valuable, I think, to cross-validate the population level because it tells you if your model is going to work on students outside the kind of sample you originally had. And this is sometimes successful, like in Sweet San Pedro's work showing that models of carelessness that are trained in America work in the Philippines and vice versa. And sometimes it's not successful, like in some of our group's work, to model student affect, finding that models of student affect trained on rich white suburban kids in America don't work on urban Latino kids. And that's an important thing to know if you want to use those models in those contexts. I should point out, by the way, that that population-level cross-validation is different from just having demographic variables in your model, which is a practice you see sometimes. It can be a dangerous one because a J48 decision tree that, say, has race as a variable is going to explicitly, if it's in the model, explicitly treat African-American students, for example, different than white students when they do the exact same thing. Depending on what country you're in, that can actually be illegal. That can be considered racial profiling. So it's important to be careful when you're doing that kind of use of demographic variables. So today's focus in this talk is on content-level cross-validation. So how well do models do when they're applied to new content? And if you're going to be building new content in your system, for instance, in an intelligent tutoring system, you're going to want to know probably that your model is going to apply new content. If you're doing prediction based on course taking and whether somebody's at risk, you probably want to know if it'll work for a different set of courses. So what Mike did was he took models for evaluating scientific inquiry processes, like the design of controlled experiments, built on one learning system, on one set of content, and tried to test if it would work on students working in a new science topic. And there's been relatively limited study of content-level generalizability, although there has been some. And in specific, what this paper is about is seeing when you're doing content-level cross-validation, what type of approaches for selecting your test data, for splitting data into training and test folds, yield better generalizability results. So, for example, should you use student-level stratification? Well, first of all, you could do no stratification. You could just randomly assign data points, given that you're doing training and test folds that are different content, but you could still kind of randomly assign a fold. Or you could stratify by student, making sure that students are equally represented in each of the folds. Again, different from student-level cross-validation that assigns to folds based on student. So you could try to get every student equally represented in every fold, or you could try to get your content within the activities equally assigned to every fold. So in specific, what Mike did is he said, there's a history of student activities they do in the learning environment I'll show in a minute. And what happens if we try to stratify by where in the activity they are when assigning a training test folds so that every training and test fold is representative of the sequence of activity? So all that is in the context of science assessments now being called the INC ITS, which is a web-based learning environment where middle school students conduct inquiry with simulations for physics, life, and earth science. And give you an example of the phase change activity. So in the phase change activity, students have to conduct experiments, and they can change variables, and they make hypotheses. So this shows the student making a hypothesis. So if I change for example, the amount of heat so that it goes up, the other variable, for example, the time to boil, will go down. That might be a hypothesis. And within that, the student runs the simulation, and you can see it puts a flame. It's more animated than this, but I'm always afraid of demos. It has a little flame, and the ice goes down, and you see a graph of the temperature of the ice over time. And a table shows up underneath. I've kind of collapsed the diagram here, showing the student the trials they've run and what the results were. And then after that, the student analyzes the data and looks at whether their original hypotheses were correct and makes interpretations. So the idea of science assessments is that the student learns domain content in the sciences while also learning inquiry skills. And to the end of learning inquiry skills, there are some detectors that try to automatically infer inquiry skill. And in particular, there are two data collection skills of interest that I'll talk about right now, which are designing controlled experiments. So who here has heard of VOTAT or CVS? Okay. Three hands. So VOTAT is very one thing at a time. If you're trying to do a set of scientific experiments, changing only one thing between experiments is a good thing to do. But it turns out that's actually a little bit hard to detect because sometimes students will play around a little bit and then get down to business and do good things. Some students will change two things and change one back. So it's actually hard to assess based on just knowledge engineered rules, but human beings can look at sequences and say whether they're appropriate. And the second thing is testing the stated hypothesis. Do the trials that the student run allow them to make inferences about what they think they're making inferences about? So the approach we use is we use data mining to build detectors to evaluate those two skills. And the approach is that first, data is collected from within the assessment system with real students in real classrooms using the system. Next, and I'll show this in a minute, text replay clips are built to allow human beings to label the data with reference to the skills. And I'll show this in a sec. You define features from the data set, and then you build and validate the detectors. So here's an example of a text replay. It just basically pretty prints in a easy-to-read format everything the student did. So in this case, the student, if you see the number 22 in the middle, the student started the simulation, changed one variable. They haven't even run it yet, so they're not comparing to anything. Ran one experiment, changed one variable, ran an experiment, reset the experiment, and reran the exact same thing. So that's a fairly clear example where the student both tested the hypothesis they were supposed to, because their hypothesis is about the level of heat, and they changed the level of heat, and they designed an experiment that could be used to make an inference about the level of heat. So they both designed and controlled experiments, and they tested the hypothesis that they had stated. So once we have these human labels, and these human labels are made over several hundred cases, there's a process of finding candidate features, building a candidate model, and repeatedly doing that with a cross-validation procedure. Again, where we build the model on part of the data, test on another part. And these detectors, we already know from past work that they're pretty good. Using student-level cross-validation and a held-out test set separately, and building them and testing them on the same microworld, the same physics topic, phase change, which I just showed, we get performance where A prime, and A prime is the probability of one student, you have an urn of students who design controlled experiments. You have an urn of students who failed to. You take one marble out of each urn, and you compare them, and you see the probability the model will be able to tell you which is which. It's equivalent to the area under the receiver operating curve also called AUC-ROC in signal detection theory. And first-level medical diagnostics are usually A prime of about 0.8 to 0.85. Mike was getting A primes in the 0.9, so that's pretty good. Also evaluated using Cohen's kappa, which is the degree to which your final answers are better than chance. And in those cases, getting Cohen's kappa in the 0.4s to 0.7s. And again, detectors at this level of quality are usually usable for intervention of various types. But one of the questions is, are these detectors going to transfer to different science topics, or do we have to redo the entire process for every new microworld? To test this, we looked at performance in transferring to a different microworld on free fall. And you can see the interface looks quite different. There's still kind of some things to change, but the graphs are different. The visual representation is different. So same underlying kind of interaction, but a fairly different visual interface. So a completely new population, totally new students, of about 300 students in central Massachusetts were selected. They did 5 free-fall activities, and that generated 1,600 sequences of experimentation that could be looked at. So if we just do a random stratification, we can see that about 90% of the behavior the students are designing control experiments, and about 85% they're testing the right hypothesis. So students are doing pretty well on this. One thing worth noting is that in about 75% of the clips, the student ran the simulation exactly 3 times. So this may be of interest for looking at generalizability because it's not the same pattern as in the previous environment. So we can run we can stratify with 1 random clip per student, just stratifying at the student level, or we can also balance the number of runs and say that every fold is going to have a set with 2 runs, a set with 3 runs, a set with 4 runs. Again, this is the student running the simulation twice, 3 times, 4 times, or 5 times. And after 5, it became relatively uncommon, so we just looked at more than 5. So if we just stratify at the student level, things look pretty darn good. We're getting A primes around 0.9, which is, again, very good and basically just as good as the original detectors. And if we're getting kappas around 0.6, which is, again, pretty good. So this argues that detectors are applicable to this new content for an entirely new sample of students. However, if we stratify by the number of runs, that is to say we're explicitly looking at how much the student actually interacted with it and trying to make sure that we're balanced across that, we see that the A prime drops to the mid 0.8s to high 0.7s, and the kappa drops to 0.6, which is still pretty good, to the mid 0.2s. And these are not terrible numbers. I mean, A prime above 0.75 is usually usable for intervention. Even down as low as 0.7 can be usable. And so these detectors still look good, but they don't look nearly as good. They don't look, for example, as good as better than medical diagnostics now. So it's worth looking at what happened. And when we see what happened, we see that if you look at the design controlled experiments detector, the rows are number of runs you had, so 2 runs, 3 runs, 4 runs, 5 runs, and more than 5. You can see that that detector, the A prime, is just exceptional when we're only looking at very small amounts of data. But when you get to the student trying more things, actually the model completely explodes, and as it gets to 5 and 6, the model does a lot worse. And you see a similar pattern over there. And part of what's going on here is, if you remember, that 3 runs was kind of overly common in the data set. So when we get the rarer cases, the model's doing relatively poorly. Now, you might say that that's okay. Thank you. You might say that's okay because maybe it still did well when we stratified by student. The model still works well for new students. So if the run distribution in the test data is genuinely representative of the variability in what students actually do, then the model's probably still okay in general. But it's worth noting that when students run more trials, they're kind of mucking around more. These are the cases where we want to be more certain. After if a student just runs 2 trials, it's fairly straightforward to say, did they control experiment or did they not? For only 2 trials, either they varied one thing or they didn't. So it's the harder cases that we're not doing as well at, and the cases where we want to have a detector that does better. So one of the things we can say here is that if we really want to know how reliable our model is, we really have to do the run level stratification and think about possibly retraining our models, taking that into account. And I guess the key point here, maybe the key takeaway point, is that content, you can say we did content level cross-validation. You can say we validated our models on new content. And that's a good thing, but how you do the stratification can give you a very different answer. And that's important if you want reliable, scalable performance assessment to know how your model is going to do on the full set of conditions where you might want to apply it. And in general, it's important to consider how the model is going to be used. It may be those rare cases might not matter. In this case, it means we're systematically estimating worse on the cases that are hard. And it's important to validate in multiple ways depending on how you want to generalize a model. You know, if you just want to generalize your model to populations very, very similar to the original one you tested on. For example, if you're building predictive analytics models for a college, and that college is the college you want to use those models on forever after, then you're probably okay just using student-level cross-validation. If you want to show that your model is going to work in broader populations, you probably want to collect data from multiple populations and cross-validate at that level. You know, if you want your models to work on, for example, a national sample of students, and then you probably want to make sure that you've got a full range of demographic groups, of populations, regions, and so on. And if you want to use your system just within the exact learning system you build it for, then again, you're probably pretty safe not doing content level cross-validation. But if you want to make sure that it's going to work for new systems similar to yours, then you want to do that. And in particular, if you do that, you want to make sure your stratification pays attention to the different contexts. And as future work, one of the things that we're going to be looking at is what factors can help us increase our generalizability to new contexts. So Mike had a paper at UMAP 2012 where he showed that beyond just taking goodness of fit in model selection, if you actually take expert assessments of which features are likely to be good parts of the model, it leads to better generalizability to new data. So that's one thing that's worth looking at here. What do we think the features are that will generalize across learning environments? Which do we think probably won't? And can we try to bias in favor of that when we build our models? Also, again, it's worth having a variable data set that varies on the dimensions you want to make sure your model will generalize to. And in general, how far can our models transfer? In this case, we saw that depending on stratification, the models are either still great or basically still okay, but not as good for another topic within physics. What happens if we change to other domains, for example, where vary one thing at a time doesn't even work, where there are interaction effects between variables and we have to take account of that? How well are our models going to do when we make that kind of transfer? So thank you all for your attention, and I will be happy to do my best to answer your questions.
Thank you, Ryan, for this presentation. Questions? Yes, please.
Thank you for an really interesting paper, which shows the complexity of the issues that you're dealing with. The question I have is that at the beginning, I mean, I was very impressed with the A prime numbers when you were building the model. But you had two very different K values. One was low, 0.45, if I can remember, and the other one was high. When you were yeah. Now, why do you think the K value was so low in the designing controlled experiments, and would that give you some clue as to why, when you repeat, that the models aren't so stable?
So that's a really good question. I'd like to make one clarification first, and that's that Cohen's kappa of 0.45 is, if you're going to say that's a low kappa value, then that actually throws out a lot of data mine models. Of a lot of constructs that have been very effective in intervention, because 0.45 means you're 45% of the way from chance to perfect, where chance is defined as the base rate. So that's still a decent model. But why would you have that big difference? So you get lower kappas, typically, you get a big split between kappa and A prime when you have a model that's good at getting relative order, but relatively bad at getting exactly the right cut point. Because kappa doesn't take model confidence and uncertainty into account, whereas A prime does. So what this means on the whole is that model, if it tells you a student's at 40% or 60%, you know it's kind of in the middle. But if it tells you 98% versus 2%, you can really trust it. 98% versus 50%, you know there's a difference. But whether or not it's 45% or 58%, you probably shouldn't trust it that much. So that tells you that model should probably be used in a fail-soft fashion, where you're going to do a different intervention if you're around the 50% level, even if you're, say, at 52% than if you're at 90%. So going to the next question, does that kind of account for the lower generalizability? Probably. Even though those two models kind of look similar in terms of A prime, there's clearly more flaws in the one with kappa of 0.45. It's clearly a weaker model, and so that's going to explain why it's going to probably be less robust. So I think that that's already a relative warning sign about the relative goodness of those two models. It's a great point. Thank you. I agree with you. It is the tougher variable. And in fact, when human beings try to code it, for testing state hypothesis, human beings get kappas of essentially 1. Whereas for designing control experiments, human beings get kappas in the 0.7 range, which, 70% better than chance, but clearly below 100%. And definitely, no detector or model should have a better kappa than the original training labels used to build it. If you get that, there's something wrong. So yeah, another great point. Thank you. Oh, dear. John?
So, Ryan, can you talk a little bit about your thinking about generalization from a specific model to a specific test and that fit versus kind of a surface of tests or a surface of generalization space? Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. And with content level cross-validation, that's harder to do than with student level. Because with student level, you have a large number of possible samples to go from. For content level, doing a really good content level cross-validation implies, across a lot of different content to really get the surface, implies that you've coded a lot of data for a lot of disparate systems. But a few of the things you can do, with our work on gaming a system a few years ago, where we tested whether detectors of gaming transferred across different tutors, we were able to get a better picture because we had, I think 5 examples that we could generalize between, and we were able to see kind of what that surface looked like a little more. You need a bigger sample still, though, if you want to not just see kind of what the range is, and well, the range and the standard deviation and such, but also which factors lead to better generalizability. I'm not aware of any examples of content level cross-validation that had enough examples to look at that, but boy, I think it'd be cool. And if there's great research out there I'm not aware of, tell me because I'd love to cite it. Great point. Thank you.